It is my pleasure to welcome Manish from Pi Ventures and Vishesh from Speciale Invest to join me in this discussion.
Thank you, Srikant. Pleasure to be
Hey,
here.
Manish. Hi, Vishesh.
Hi, Manish. Hi, Srikant. Excited to be here.
Yes, looking forward to this. So let's get started. So at the outset, just tell us something about. So Manish, I'll start with you. Tell us a little bit about Pi Ventures, your investment thesis, and more importantly, how did SpaceTech happen, and what is it you see in SpaceTech?
Sure. So we are a deep tech fund. We invest in all areas of deep tech. Started off as a more AI-focused fund back in 2016. And we typically do early stage. We are now investing. Our first fund was around 30 million. We've done 15 companies from that. And now we are investing out of our second fund, which we are still raising, but it's likely to be around 75 to 100 million range. And the thesis has evolved, of course. Earlier we were looking at AI, but now we look at all forms of deep tech. Space actually, I think, happened by accident for us. So this was back in Fund 1, and I think Vishesh only introduced Agnikul to us, and we actually didn't realize the power of what they were building in our first couple of meetings. But slowly, as we interacted more with the entrepreneur, got hooked to what he was building and studied the sector a little bit more. And that's how we actually got into space, a little bit by accident, I would say.
Interesting. We actually had Srinath speak with us last year at the Maiden SpaceTech Summit. So it's a small circle. I see that. So Vishesh, how did talk about Speciale Invest? How did your fund start? What's your investment philosophy, and how did SpaceTech happen? Looks like you and Manish already connected. So I want to hear that your side of the story.
Yeah, no, Manish is a dear friend. He's been very kind to us as well. So as a firm, we're a little over 4 years old. We're a pre-seed seed fund, which typically means we're coming in very early, pre-product, sometimes product in the works sort of stage of life, mostly no revenues. So we like to operate in that world of uncertainty. We're investing from our second fund. Our first fund was about close to $10 million. The second fund about $40 million. We're a deep science tech and SaaS fund. So close to half or a little more than half goes into deep science and technology, which historically has been physical sciences, but we're sort of also leaning towards doing physical sciences and biosciences as well going forward. And of course, within physical sciences, we've been fortunate to spend time with founders in EV, aerospace, space, robotics, a few of those sectors. In space, we've been fortunate to make 3 or 4 investments, so there's a lot of learning that we've had. On the second question on how did we end up doing space, I mean, quite honestly, a lot of serendipity, just like what Manish indicated. I think we started to bump into a bunch of people who kept telling us that satellites were getting smaller, and that sort of got us to spend more time to realize that there's a revolution happening. Depending on how much time you have, we can cover some of that later on why space tech and what got us over there. Maybe that's a separate discussion by itself. But
no, I do have quite a few questions. Yeah,
like Manish indicated, the minute once you start spending time, you just start to realize how deep the rabbit hole is.
Yeah.
And how much gold is on the other side of the rainbow.
Yeah. So on that, right? So what's the TAM here, the market here that, and obviously you're betting big, on this sector, and we are at very early stages in the privatization of space. We had a morning discussion in the morning with Dr. Vinod from InSpace. There's quite a bit happening, but how big is the market here globally, and what do you think India can capture? Can you give us some numbers just to help us understand?
So I can give you numbers, but I'm going to look really foolish in hindsight 5 years from now. There are certain industries which are rapidly evolving, and there are certain industries that are non-linearly growing. They're two very different things. I think space tech is in that place where all assumptions of TAM sizing are constantly changing. So, I've read anywhere numbers from 400 billion to a few $1 trillion, and big names like Morgan Stanley, all of them sort of putting out reports on these categories. So the numbers are large, and it doesn't matter because we're at ground zero. So there's just a lot of growth you can capture. So the question is, on who's going to put what product out with what technical capabilities that allows you to then capture market. So I think the race is not towards capturing market share. The race is about putting a good quality product that works.
So it's more of a creation of a market simultaneously while evaluating the market.
The market's constantly evolving and growing, and it's very large. I think as far as the opportunity for India, and this is the fun part of space tech, is you're global from day zero. Right? So the opportunity is as large and as wide as the entire TAM sits.
Yeah, in fact, you're beyond global, you're in space. So
yeah, so I think the opportunity is quite large. The immediate opportunity for a lot of the companies that we're seeing is in the low Earth orbit. I mean, there is in space, there's downstream, which is what we heard the SAT show team talk about, and then there's upstream. And in upstream, there's deep space, which is far away from Earth, and then there is low Earth orbit, which is within the a few hundred kilometers of Earth. And I think in the next few years, a lot of that is around Earth, and I'm sure the decade thereafter is clearly beyond Earth.
Interesting. So Manish, how do you see the numbers? I mean, is that even the valid question to ask at this stage, as Vishesh pointed out, or do you see some pattern in the numbers already?
Yeah, actually, I have never thought about how big the space opportunity is in terms of numbers, right? But let me try and explain a slightly different perspective that we have on this and how we are trying to understand this, right?
Yeah.
So if you think about the various, and this is a broad categorization, may not be accurate as well, but this is our understanding. We see 4 different big areas in space itself, right? So one is the transportation sector. How do you go from Earth to space? Simply, right? So this satellite transportation sector. The other is the sensing sector. So if I have satellites, I'm innovating on different kind of sensors, etc. How do I put my stuff out there, which can sense different things on the Earth, and then use it for different applications. The third emerging sector, which is little in the future, is in space sector. So there are different things coming up within space. So how do you do traffic management within so many satellites? How do you do debris removal, etc.? So there is some in space, and there will be some other things, by the way, as well, like in space manufacturing and other applied areas of space that will come up, right? And fourth is the space exploration, which is about how do we find water on Mars and all that.
Yeah,
you clearly leave the fourth out. I think that is government funding, and those are more driven by a different kind of money. The first 3 areas are what typically me and Vishesh and other investors are typically trying to invest and look into. In that also, if you see, the third area is an emerging area. It's the in-space thing is not yet that hot. It will probably 2, 3, 4 years to incubate. So it comes down to actually thinking about 2 areas: transportation and sensing.
Interesting.
And now again, unravel it, right? Sensing, you can just think how big the sensing market can be, right? Because now requirements for everybody is changing. They want faster connectivity. They want more connectivity. They want more data in different forms, not just visual. They want IR form. They want this, they want that, right? So that opportunity is very, very big, right?
And it changes by the use case, by the sector.
It evolves, right? It is evolving every time. So obviously, as Vishesh said, this is a global market. It is not related to India only or whatever, right? So then the opportunity seems big for us. We have not put a number on it, but it's big enough to kind of go and build businesses which are worth, hundreds of millions of dollars, right? The other is the transportation sector, where we have invested in Agnicool as well, right? So how do you get satellites from down Earth to space above, right? So that also, now the number of satellites have increased multiple times in the last few years, and because of the number 2 that we talked about, the number of satellites are going to increase. So there will be an increased pressure on, how can I get a satellite in the appropriate orbit at the right time when I need it, right? So that is the trend that we are seeing in the transportation bit. And within that, if you see Agnicool's problem statement, satellites are shrinking, launch capacities are at, and therefore to cater to satellites which need to go up in space at their will, right, when they want it to the orbit, you will need democratization. You will need that sector to open up where small rockets become a feasibility, which by Agnicool technology, they are actually claiming to solve it, and they are solving it rather.
Yeah.
And other technologies of conventional rockets don't actually address that because it becomes inefficient to build rockets of that size. So in our viewpoint, that is also a big market because there are so many satellites going up. So
Yeah.
that is how we have sort of tried to understand the whole space, and still learning every day that we meet entrepreneurs with new problem statements and solutions.
Yeah, and interestingly, just in the previous panel with Chris from Cover Space and Sanjay from Dhruva, we talked about one of the outcomes of miniaturization, which is basically what has happened in the smartphone revolution. You can literally start thinking about having a personal satellite at some point, right? So, and you never know, that could open up a whole new set of use cases, much like how smartphones opened up app stores. Right? Quite interesting. Now, so Vishesh, I want to go back to one of the questions, points you made before about non-linearity and value creation. So obviously, as an investor, you're making a big bet, and this is not something you work backwards. You said, hey, this is going to be whatever 400 billion, so I need a pie of that. That was not the calculation. Clearly, you're betting on a value creation, and you believe that this is going to be non-linear. So obviously, that's a very big bet to take, right? With at such a nascent stage, and the risks are pretty high. So my question is, why now? Why not 5 years back, or why not even 5 years later? Right? What has changed? What's happening now so much that everyone is willing to take that bet? Not everyone, few of you, but then why are you even taking that bet?
Good question. You're never going to get timing right. I mean, especially as a VC, it's just very hard to get timing right. And if you do get timing right, you just have to say you're lucky. At least that's what we believe in. But I think there are a few patterns that you sort of want to look out for. And when you also go and look at this whole Gartner curve, you see a hype cycle, then you see it sort of coming down, then it sort of picks up again.
Yeah.
So space is not, this is not space 1.0 as far as India is concerned, though there's just a lot of press and PR about private space because the policy has given it a lot of credibility. There has already been a space 1.0 5, 7, 8, 10 years ago, including Chris at Kava, he was at Exceed Space. NP was at Dhruva, and Dhruva had its whole history. So I think there was an attempt to build Space 1.0, and some companies did well, some didn't. The timing wasn't right. The policy was not compelling enough. And then they went through that learning cycle, right? And every industry sort of goes through that learning cycle. Internet had it back in the .com, now came back 10, 15 years again. I think possibly space is having that journey where specific to India, this is Space 2.0. These are companies from 2017 to 2025 that are building the second generation of space startups in India. So that way, there have been a bunch of early guys who've gone and built things, done things, made a few things right, a few things wrong, enough so for people to learn and come back. That's the first piece. That's specific to India. And that's specific to the policy also sort of taking its shape that allows for functionality between private and the government. The other larger evolving piece that's also a guiding light is just how global space economy has evolved. In 2008, SpaceX was a startup. In 2020, SpaceX is sending people on behalf of NASA to space. Right? So that evolution, that maturity of the Americans, the Europeans, and of course the Indian Space Organization itself, has sort of given space a segment or an industry category by itself. That's not just meant for defense or the government, but that's meant for commercial use cases. Now, this coinciding effect of India having seen its first cycle, the global market sort of technically being more mature, the global markets opening up from an economic acceptance of the data or what space can do for them, have all sort of culminated to timing or propelling this market to go from where it is. And which is why, as a VC, you're never going to time this right. If you do, you're lucky, at least that's what I think. So because you've got 2 or 3 of these moving things that need to come together for something to happen. But good news is it's happening. So this is a great time to participate.
Yeah, interesting. Manish, how do you see, and how do you measure, if you will, value creation, right? And what, according to you, so obviously, Vishesh, you covered quite a bit, but Manish, what do you see is changing about the why now question from your vantage point?
See, we can sort of talk about the macro, which Vishesh has done, but there is in my opinion, there is a lot of micro picture that we need to look at. So what it means is that, of course, there is a bigger acceptance for people doing space startups, right? Uh, uh, Talent-wise, we never lack it. Sometimes we lack in our ambitions as Indian
Mhm.
entrepreneurs. So that part has been solved, I think, somewhere by
Yeah,
having that momentum of people trying to do crazy things. And
yeah,
imagine that we can make an rocket engine printed by 3D printing and stuff like that, right? And there are
yeah,
metric
yeah.
examples of that. So there is a bit of macro picture where the sector has got legitimacy and more sort of it's a house conversation like AI was like 4 or 5 years back, 6 years back. People didn't know what artificial intelligence is. Now everybody knows, right? So it is just about that preparedness of the ecosystem to
Yeah.
be able to do that. But I think and that is important. But the value creation, to your point, actually lies in the micro picture. So in all these experiments, right? So one way to looking at that is that macro pictures enable people to experiment with their ideas of what they can do in the space sector largely.
Yeah.
But the value creation will happen by specific problem solution set that will click and not click. So in that, of course, we meet a lot of entrepreneurs, and some problem areas fit very well. Okay, there is a deep problem in the global market, and here is a startup which is solving that very well. And if you
Mhm.
are solving that very well at global scale, the value creation is there. I mean, there is it is no doubt. But when the problem, it goes down to the basics. Actually, if the problem
Yeah.
solution fit is slightly loose, or it's not that hot right now, I don't, customers may not need it, but they may need it
Mm.
years later, etc., then the value creation will be lower, slower, or may not be there. So
Mm.
I think the value creation why now is more of a the momentum thing, and the value creation is going to come from those problem statements which are being solved very well.
Interesting. So that brings to a point that you had touched upon, both of you have touched upon, which is it comes down to the entrepreneur, in one sense, because the sector is evolving so much. I think entrepreneurs are learning from the market. You're learning from the entrepreneurs. They're learning from you. So there's obviously um, this whole cycle going on. But specifically uh, about space tech entrepreneurs, do you see do you have a different measuring bar of how you decide whether to invest in a particular space tech entrepreneur or not? Or for you, entrepreneur is an entrepreneur is an entrepreneur. It doesn't matter as long as you have product market fit. Is there something different you look for in a space tech entrepreneur, Manish?
Yeah, I mean, see, as an entrepreneur, I mean, I would change this question a little bit. How do you analyze a space tech startup?
Mhm.
Entrepreneur is part of that analysis, right?
Mm.
So we go back and then we go and look at what problem they're solving. So let us say if you're solving a transportation problem or
Mhm.
a sensing problem, right? The skill set required may be different in two cases and how it is.
Yeah.
So one of the things though, in both these things requires, which is slightly different from a, let's say, a total digital startup.
Yeah.
Suppose I'm doing an AI company, which is
Yeah. Or a SaaS based startup. SaaS is like a
or SaaS
quite
based startup, right?
hot sector.
It's a
Yeah.
physical element that is very real, right? So you need, for example, a company like Agnicool, they need a space where you can test out your engines, right? So
Mm.
it's not about sitting on the computer in a cushy AC environment and solving problems, but it
Mm.
is logging out 30 kilometers down with Chennai without restroom access to
Mm.
build those sheds to get these things up. So I think
Yeah.
the additional part in my mind, apart from the regular things that you do in the context of problem statement fit, is about the ability for entrepreneurs, uh, again, depending upon the problem they're solving, is to have an ability to solve the operational side of things, which need not be digital, right?
Mm.
And in certain cases, you may have to work with government agencies to get permissions,
Yeah.
regulations, etc. So that's another skill you need. So it requires probably a little bit more slightly different skill set if your startup involves that physical element, which typically it will in the first two segments of the space that we talked about.
Interesting. Vishesh, how do you see this question? Do you see it, or would you also change the question? But the idea is, can you also share some anecdotes about the experiences you've seen on the ground interacting? Obviously, you invested in a few startups, which means you met a lot more entrepreneurs.
I think Manish is bang on. If I were to add a couple of points on top of that, I think you need a lot of tenacity to go build hardware. You need a lot more tenacity to build space because you're going to work across regulation, across policy, across government, across global consumers. So I think we're essentially looking for founders who are willing to look at businesses not for 5-10 years, but 15-20 years of building. Right? So you want somebody who's got that long-term view to organization, institutionalization, and evolve from being a startup to thinking long-term. I think that is very important to see in the founder. And I'll dip into the other point that Manish has also talked about value creation, and I think specific to how both funds operate. I think we have pretty high bar on why you need to solve this and what are you solving so differently, right? So the first part is for the market fit towards your own relevancy to this industry, and that sort of gives you the unique vantage point to look at this industry or this problem and solve it very differently from others. I mean, if you were to go back to Srinath and Agnikul, their problem statement was, hey, we need to get small satellites to space when they want. And that basically meant we need to make rockets fast, which meant you need to 3D print rockets in a few days as against a few months. That was the first part of the problem statement. The second part of the problem statement was we will do all of this agnostic to the size of the satellite, which meant we will mass customize the rocket.
Yeah.
Right. So, and that sort of unique insight came from a lot of their historical backgrounds and just their ability to build a cross-functional team, right? There's software, there's avionics, there's hardware, there's policy, there are consultants, and it's a cross-functional organization. So you need a lot of tenacity to hang in there and build.
So, as a follow-on question, just flipping the question the other way, do you see in your daily life interacting with entrepreneurs, do you see any mindset blockers when it comes to space tech in the entrepreneurs that are pitching to you as part of your deal flow, right? Do you at all see any sort of like a mindset blocker or a behavioral blocker in their mind because of which the people are not getting into space tech? Obviously, there are very few space tech startups as we speak, right? It's not like SaaS where almost the percentage of people turning SaaS entrepreneurs is extremely high, which is good. But clearly there is, I sense that there is a mindset blocker, but I wanted to hear your view. You think, is it a mindset blocker, or is it that people are just not aware of the space and hence you're not seeing as many space tech startups are, say, compared to SaaS or something?
I think the cost of experimentation in a SaaS startup is much, much lower than a space tech startup, right? So if you're doing something software, two founders, typically they can hack around, get a prototype done, right? And then start playing around with it. In a space tech startup, which requires a physical element, right? The cost of experiment is higher, right? And the time. So another thing is, like, again, in a SaaS startup, I can build a prototype, I can show to a customer, he can play around with it. All this can happen in 6 months and I can get a feedback. That feedback cycle can be few years in a space tech startup. So just those elements.
Can you elaborate on that point? Why would the feedback cycle be longer? Just give an example. Why is there a longer?
Suppose you are building rockets, right? Agnikul is building rockets. I think when did they start? Probably 4 years ago, 4.5 years ago. Their first flight is happening now, right? So obviously they have got a lot of feedback from customers, but the real customer launch is going to happen after that. Right? Okay. So tell me one SaaS startup which has launched their first product after 4 years of building. So that gestation period, that gestation time, etc., requires a different mindset to do it. And a lot of this is more of an engineering point, since I come from an engineering background. a lot of founders and startups use customers at their QA testing team, right? So you launch something and they'll tell you what's not working. You can't do that in a SpaceTech startup, right? So there is a lot of stuff you need to put in to kind of reviews, testing, repeatability, this, that, all that rigor has to show up before you do something with your customer.
Very interesting. I think that's a very powerful mindset blocker, which I think trying to get to. I think thanks, Manish, for sharing that. It's so the amount of thinking, deep thinking you have to do before you even throw out your prototype or even start designing a prototype is far more higher than in a mature industry like SaaS, where, as you rightly put, the customer can be the QA person because there's not so much at stake here for a customer to spend 5 minutes of their time. I think it's a brilliant insight. Vishesh, what do you see as mindset blockers, if at all?
No, actually, I think the points Manish alluded just says that the bar to do this is just that much higher.
But is the bar really the know-how bar, or is it that it just takes more capital to do this? Like a SaaS startup, as both of you pointed out, you could just hack it up.
I think it is a know-how bar. I don't think this is throwing capital at the problem. It's throwing engineering and know-how and domain and industry understanding with capital. You're just not going to put $3, $4, $5 million and build a rocket. That's not how it works. No.
Interesting.
I think the bar is high.
But do you think the bar is a know-how bar, not necessarily a capital bar?
The ones who have the know-how will think it's a capital bar, and capital is always a bar in anything in life, right? It's not that capital is always freely available to do anything.
Yeah.
But if you were to sort of compare this sector with others, you're not going to see hundreds of them. You're going to see less than that to begin with, at least for the next 5 years, and then build up from there. I honestly haven't seen founders who come to us with a mental block on this sector. So I don't have any evidence of that in my experience. In fact, we've seen folks come and talk big things. Like we've got a team, like Manish mentioned in space, we've got a team that's saying they'll build a factory in space. They want to do repairs and maintenance of satellites because there are not many satellites out there. So people are thinking I have to play catch up.
Interesting. So, what a move. Yeah, sorry, Manish. Yeah.
The blockers that you're talking about probably or thinking about are probably blockers that are not helping people get into space. But if you get into space, then you may not see those blockers, right?
Because they've cleared those blockers and they're in already. Yeah. Yeah. So, just moving. So there is a talk about space tech companies and then space adjacent tech companies, right? So that these are companies that can build on top of the output that's coming out. We had an earlier discussion with Chris and Sanjay about how once sufficient miniaturization as well as sufficient number of satellites exist, and once the data feeds are done, you could have literally like an API kind of system. We talked about a use case of urban mobility. It's equivalent of how an app developer on a smartphone does not necessarily think of building the smartphone, the hardware, right? So obviously so there is a space adjacent sector which will utilize the output data coming out from the satellites and all 4 of the levels that you talked about. But at this point, is there any sign of such companies coming out, space adjacent companies, or is that still some time away? Manish, what do you think? Are you seeing any of those companies?
I've been there for quite some time. You see, the thing is that if you talk about at least the way I have understood the way you've asked that question, maybe my understanding is not correct, but is the second category in our categorization, the sensing part, right?
Mm-hmm.
That sensing data is coming back to Earth. Somebody has to analyze it,
correct,
some insights and doing it.
Yeah.
So that's actually an old industry. That's not a new industry. It has been around. And what is changing in there is because new sensors are coming, new kind of data capability, how fast you can do it, at what level you can do it, etc., etc. So those are the new things that are happening there. But that's an old industry. It's not a new upcoming industry in my mind, at least.
Okay. Vishesh, how do you see that?
I'm on the same page. I don't think it's an adjacent industry at all. It's in fact an equally large piece of the TAM. And they sort of feed into each other, right? The more people can use geodata to do more things and more business use cases, the more there is a need to put another satellite back in space. So I think you're going to see a lot of iterative growth on both these categories for the next 5 to 10 years, at which point of time they will stabilize.
Yeah, and also this
and this industry has been the leading indicator for space tech. It's what you can do with data that compels people to put upstream infrastructure.
Correct. And also the reason I asked that question is if you look at GPS and then fundamentally the concept of Google Maps. Without GPS, there wouldn't be Google Maps. Without Google Maps, there wouldn't have been an Uber, right? And so it's a derivative, multiple derivatives. But the reason I asked that question is, as the input data to these data analysis companies changes and becomes better, new industries that you wouldn't have thought of could actually come up, right? So, and that was actually my question: that are you beginning to see that triple derivative level stuff happening, or is that still some time away? Because obviously the data that's coming out from some of these satellites, from what I understand from my discussion with Chris and Sanjay, is like nothing maybe you've seen before, right? It's like a whole new type of data coming in.
Yeah, I think we endorse that view from Chris. We're early investors and partners with him. I think there are the financial services and risk management industry, possibly the early movers saying, let's do nonlinear things with this data.
Yeah.
But I think there was an Amazon investor presentation where they were able to show the parking lot of Walmart before and after. It showed that the number of cars were lesser, right? I mean, as micro as that, I think the opportunity is being made. Some of this also has a positive cascading effect when the cost of data drops, and I think that's the big bet. And I think that's where the previous panel possibly alluded to, saying you and I could possibly have our own private news feed or data feed from up there.
Absolutely, that's quite exciting. That's why I brought this.
What we do.
Yeah, that's why I brought this point up from across the panels. It's quite exciting to see the type of possibilities that open up. We have a few minutes left, and I just have a couple of things I want to get from you. First is, again, both Vishesh and Manish, are you, from a fund point of view, are you concerned about the future? How do you measure your returns, right? Obviously, there is a returns game to this whole thing, and from what you said, there is non-linearity. It's a high-risk game. So, at the outset, I mean, obviously, you've gone ahead and invested in these companies. You've taken the bets. So, how did you do that calculation to say, okay, this is? Did you do the usual SaaS healthcare company return, because there are ready-made models out there you can pretty much estimate? So here, how would you measure your returns? Is it going to be the same way you've done it for SaaS or health tech or edtech, or is it completely different?
At the end of the day, you have to return money to your LPs. So it all will come down to that, right? Measuring return. Am I concerned about the future? Well, that's a deep question. But yes, definitely excited about the future. And I think one thing that remains constant in the investing world is, no matter how well you analyze, no matter how well you do your diligence, the luck factor plays out to a large extent. So I think it will be no different space, I guess. So, if you're taking, of course, you got to do your diligence and all, but over a period of time, we are hoping that some of our companies will succeed and provide us that return, which makes our LPs also happy. But there is another return that which is very exciting to me as somebody in the technology domain, right? If we can see these companies succeed at a global level from an innovation done with India beyond monetary terms, I mean. There is that thing that will obviously remain irrespective of what happens.
Absolutely. I think that's great to hear. There is a non-financial return here too, right?
Yep.
So, Vishesh, how do you see?
Yeah, I mean, I endorse what Manish says. I think if I can add on top of that, if you end up doing something non-linear and exponential, there's clearly a lot of value creation happening out there. And it's a question of which part of the pie and what you get. And those will evolve along the way. So, if you're building a rocket company that actually does fly, then there's clearly wealth to be made at the end of that journey.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And am I concerned about the future? I think my optimism exceeds my pessimism. And if you're in this business, you got to live that way.
Absolutely. I think that we are at the end of the panel, but it's been an amazing conversation with both of you, Manish and Vishesh. Uh, I think we covered. We see that basically it's a non-linear bet that you're taking on the future, and I think there is sufficient threshold of talent out here, and I think we clearly see that India could have a major play on the global stage. So, and thanks to people like you who are supporting entrepreneurs. It was great having this conversation with you. Thank you so much for joining me, Manish and Vishesh.
Guys, thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.